Back in the late 1980s, when then Colorado Senator Gary Hart was running for president, he had a reputation as a womanizer. But it wasn't anything anyone could prove or anything a political reporter would seriously write about. That all changed when the Miami Herald got a tip and ran with a story that brought Hart down. It's all documented in a new book by Matt Bai, who joins us in a minute. First, some background. Colorado Senator Gary Hart had it all. Smart, handsome, and he was the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee in 1987. Then this. The Miami Herald staked out Hart's D.C. townhouse and discovered and reported that a young woman had spent the night there. Hart emphatically denied the story. But when this photograph of him and one-time model Donna Rice aboard the aptly named Monkey Business then surfaced, he was politically finished. Hart blamed the press.
We're all going to have to seriously question the system for selecting our national leaders that reduces the press of this nation to hunters and presidential candidates to being hunted.
In his new book, All the Truth Is Out, reporter Matt Bai writes that the Gary Hart-Donna Rice affair was the pivotal moment when the relationship between the press and politicians changed forever.
From the illumination of ideas and the ability to communicate them to how do we find out the lie? You're lying about something.
BU professor Tom Fiedler, that young Miami Herald reporter who broke the story, says that was not his intent.
What did change and what was changing by the time Gary Hart came up is that the press took it more on as its proper role to vet the candidates who were running in the primaries. And the press was pulled into the role of assessing the candidate in every dimension. And it was increasingly important that people know not just where a candidate stood on issues, because issues change, but who they were.
As for that infamous Gary Hart challenge to the press to follow me around, Bai says Tom Fiedler and the Miami Herald didn't know about that when they first set out to put a tail on Hart. All right, and I am now joined by author Matt Bai, who's a former political reporter for the New York Times Magazine and now writes for Yahoo News. Welcome to Greater Boston.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for having me.
Brought back, such memories, because that was such a specific, because he was in New Hampshire and was running for the primary then. But
sure.
So, you've gone back and really retraced every single inch of this, and you state emphatically that this was that turning point. But what about what Tom Fiedler says, that, things are beginning to change anyway, and the whole social, by the way, women had finally gotten on the political, Cassie Mackin was the first, when it was just the boys on the bus, nobody was writing about this stuff. So it was bound to happen, even if this was.
Oh, absolutely. This is, as you know, one of the premises of my book is that there was a lot churning in the culture at that time. You had the Watergate scandal still echoing through our politics. You had a new generation of journalists who were really bent on not allowing another liar to get into the White House. They were very focused on character and moral integrity. You had that same group of journalists looking at Woodward and Bernstein, wanting to have that kind of career, wanting to take someone down, to have that kind of glory. Changing attitudes about feminism, as you point out, changing attitudes on the right among the culture warriors of the Reagan years. So there were things churning in the culture. I don't think Gary Hart created this dynamic. I don't think the Miami Herald created this dynamic. I think it was celebrity and politics were about to collide, and they collided in that moment because Gary Hart was the first guy to walk into it.
But you seem sympathetic to Gary Hart, where I know. I think you get a little close to this one, where you weren't, for instance, with John Edwards. How do you parse those two?
Well, I think it's a complicated calculation. I think it depends on the example. But I think Hart particularly was sort of stigmatized and misunderstood in that moment. I think events moved very quickly. And you have a guy who grew up in a different political era, grew up by the rules that were enforced for Roosevelt and Johnson and Kennedy, who'd been separated from his wife a couple of times, dated in full view of Washington, stays on Bob Woodward's couch at one point when he's separated and dating. And then all of a sudden, in this moment where all these forces collide, he's standing in the alley next to his townhouse, backed up against a brick wall in a white hoodie.
Partly his fault.
While reporters, well, of course, he's always said that there were things he would have done differently. But I think the question is, did Gary Hart create that moment? Did he do something so different from what others had done before, or was there something larger going on that we should understand if we want to understand how our politics and our political journalism got to where they are?
But there was just an arrogance there, and I know a lot of it was after the fact, that whole story about follow me around. There's a quote, it is actually a quote to E.J. Dionne. It was coming out in the New York Times Magazine, follow me around, I'm serious. If anybody wants to put a tail on me, go ahead. They'd be very bored. Now, Tom Fiedler, as you write in your book, says he read that quote when he's on his way to the stakeout
Right.
in Washington, D.C.
A stakeout that had already commenced.
Yes,
right?
But he felt like he had already gotten the very same go-ahead from Gary Hart. He'd been following him, so there was an arrogance there. He was purporting to be completely innocent of all these things that he'd been sort of rumored and believed to be true about him for quite a long time.
Well, I think you're voicing only long-standing views, and certainly from people who were there at the time, and I understand people have strong feelings about it. I think if you go back and look at the facts, it's just more complicated. It's not that it's wrong, it's just a lot more complicated. We misremember the quote. We misremember in your intro, you had him, you said the photo on the boat caused him to drop out. That's not true. The photo wasn't on a boat, and it doesn't come out till weeks after he's out of the race.
I said afterwards.
We've misremembered so much of what happened here. And, you know, in the case of what he denied, he really said it was nobody's business and he was doing nothing wrong. He said he was a moral leader. When they corner him in that alley outside his house, they don't say, you said you never cheated on your wife, because as you know, that was a question asked much later. The question they say was, didn't you say you'd be a moral leader? And of course he had. But he was talking about the Reagan administration. He was talking about Iran-Contra. He wasn't talking about his personal life, because that wasn't part of the political dialogue. And so the point here isn't about whether Gary Hart was right or wrong or should have done what he did or didn't do. The point is the rules were changing in that moment. And there's a story here. It's not so much an argument, but what's at the heart of the book is this very gripping story of events we've forgotten or misremembered. And how it reverberated through the life of our politics, and how it reverberated through the life of this interesting man.
And I was interested in Gary Hart's analysis through you that had he been the nominee, George W. Bush never would have been the president, because his father, you know, he wouldn't have been elected.
Right.
Therefore, the son couldn't have ridden the coattails. Therefore, there wouldn't have been a war in Iraq.
Well, it's funny, and I put that quote in the book, and a lot of people got into it in the political science type, said, no, he wouldn't have won because the growth rate was X or Y or Z. The point for me of him saying that, as you bring it up, is firstly to understand what it is to be this man, because he's the character at the center of the book, and it really is a narrative. It's a story that I hope people can take on a plane or a train and not put down. And what he lives with and the guilt and how it affects his life is part of the story of the human toll of how we practice political journalism now. But it's also about the consequences we as journalists have to remember. Our actions have consequences. These are dominoes that fall. When somebody gets drummed out, somebody else gets elected. These are not things we do for our careers or for the public's interest in a moment and then they just go away. They all have consequences.
Well, it sounded to me,
we have to be mindful of them.
Through your book and others, the stuff that I've written, of course, read that Tom Fiedler wrote, that they did think about that there was a lot of hand-wringing over that. In fact, there's some ugliness about it, whether they should even proceed.
Well, there certainly was after the fact. The Miami Herald at the time did a 7,500 word reconstruction of all the events, and there's no discussion at all about whether or not they thought it was news. They thought it was news. I mean, they were in this moment.
If you had been that reporter?
I probably would have in the moment. I probably wouldn't have questioned it. I think what I'm saying is that I think in the years after that, we erected as an industry, and I have certainly employed them myself, a lot of rationales about why we do these stories. We do them because it's not the sex, it's the lie. We do them because if he'll lie to his wife, he'll lie to the rest of us, which we know isn't true from history. We do it because it's out there and it has to be, we owe it to the public. And we kind of carried down this current. I heard Tom Fiedler in that clip that you played. He says, he uses the term pulled in. The media was pulled into this role. I reject that. I think we have choices and judgments. And sometimes our judgment is going to lead us to cover stories like that. It would lead me to cover stories like that in some instances.
I would have the John Edwards.
But let's all agree that we have judgment to exercise, that it's not out of our hands.
All right, great book. I loved it.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much.